Hey guys, so today we're going to be taking a look at the Civil War timeline. So you should have a sheet that looks like this. Got a bunch of blanks in it, and we're going to be filling those in as we go through today. So this is going to be just kind of a good overview of the war for you as we are talking. So as we begin, let's just first of all start with these two pieces of paper right here. Okay, so I've got my blue and my gray. All right. So during the Civil War, what we are seeing is oftentimes we call it a fight between the North and the South. But I think it's important to remember that that's not the way it was seen at the time. It was seen as a fight between two separate countries. We have the United States, who wore blue uniforms, and the Confederate States of America, who had declared themselves a separate country and thought of themselves as a separate country. That's something I think that we often kind of forget as we're talking about this, is that this is two different countries who are fighting this war at that time. So you may see those blue and gray pieces of paper again, just to be aware. But that's something important to remember. Is that's the thought process during this. So let's go ahead and jump right in and get started. Okay, so the first major event that we have and really kind of kicks the whole thing off takes place in the fall and winter of 1860 as Abraham is elected the 16th president of the United States. After Abraham Lincoln's presidency, between the time he's elected to the time he is inaugurated, South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas all secede or separate themselves from the Union and form the Confederate States of America. So the thing to remember about Confederate is Confederate means that your state is more important than your federal government, okay? So states are kind of the key to a confederation, okay? Jefferson Davis, who had been a longtime Washington politician, is elected the president of this new nation, and they start to form their own separate government. So just a picture here, this is the way that the election kind of came out. If you look down at the bottom, in most of these states and in Maryland, a guy named Breckinridge is the main candidate who wins. Stephen Douglas wins in Missouri. Lincoln wins in all of the northern states and the two western states. And then Bell is on the border states here. So this is the very divisive victory. This is a photograph of Abraham Lincoln that was taken just after his election in 1860. And then this is Jefferson Davis. So 1861 rolls around, April 1861. South Carolina is their own separate nation, is a part of a separate nation. However, there is a fort just outside of South Carolina in Charleston Harbor that is still occupied by federal troops. They are barricaded in, so you can see Fort Sumter right here. They're running out of supplies. These are all Confederate stations. And according to the Confederacy, this is like a foreign government in their on their soil, right? It would be as if, Mexico set up camp in the middle of Montana, right? So the fort at Fort Sumter is quickly running out of supplies. They send a telegraph to Lincoln saying, we need some supplies. He sends a ship, the Star of the West, on January 9th to resupply it. And by April of that year, the South fires on the fort because they refuse to leave. Fortunately, no one dies in this first assault. The only casualty is actually a Confederate horse. However, the Union is forced out of the fort, and the Confederate States of America wins Fort Sumter. And these are the first shots fired of the war. They are fired by the South in April of 1861. Then, just after this happens, Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers. This causes Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina to secede. Very quickly, Lincoln takes over Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware as the border states or the buffer states. And part of the way he does this is by taking some steps that go a little bit beyond the Constitution or extra legal steps. So he suspends habeas corpus, which is the right to know what your offense is when you are arrested. He sends the military to occupy those 4 border states, and he seizes all private communication lines. So these are like telegraph lines and transportation lines. So he takes these steps as a way to kind of secure the Union against the South, realizing that this war has officially begun. Then General Winfield Scott, who was pretty old by this point, you might remember old Fuss and Feathers from the Mexican-American War, lays out a plan that becomes nicknamed the Anaconda Plan. This is going to be the North's major strategy during this war. So there's 3 things that they want to do, and these are really important. So the first thing they want to do is blockade southern ports with Navy vessels, hoping that will make it harder to get supplies in the South. The South doesn't have a lot of their own factories and manufacturing, so they're going to have to get their supplies from trade. So you blockade the South, so they can't do that. You split the South by taking control of the Mississippi River. So this is going to split the east and the west part of the South. I'll show you a map in just a second. And then the last one is to capture the southern capital, which is Richmond. And so this, when you capture a nation's capital, that's a really big deal, right? So if you look at this picture here, this is just a political cartoon that shows the Anaconda Plan. Like I said, it was thought up by Winfield Scott. And the reason it gets its name, the Anaconda Plan, is because it's like an anaconda that circles its prey and slowly suffocates it, right? So that's the kind of goal here. So you see around the edges, we've got the ships on the edges, okay, blockading the ports. You see that the snake is coming down the Mississippi River right here, in order to strangle the Mississippi River. And, of course, capture, Richmond right up here at the top, okay? So that's just a picture of what the Anaconda Plan looks like. And, again, the idea is to strangle the South, okay? In July of 1861, the first major battle takes place in Bull Run or Manassas, Virginia. So the North and the South meet just outside of D.C. Jackson and Lee are able to push forward pretty easily. However, they do not follow the Union troops into D.C. They don't press their advantage into D.C. Part of the reason is because there were a lot of civilians who just kind of showed up to watch, kind of almost like a sporting event, right? And a lot of them, when the Union soldiers start retreating, they get kind of trampled by the Union soldiers. So it's a really big, chaotic mess over at Bull Run. This is also where General Thomas Jackson gets his nickname Stonewall Jackson, because he and his men stood firm like a stone wall throughout the battle, right? So this is the first, like I said, decisive victory, and it is a Confederate or gray victory here, right? So things are not looking so good for the North at this point. They thought it was going to be a really easy win, and the first Battle of Bull Run shows that it's not going to be as easy as possible. Next major battles that we have are from February to April of that year. So it starts when Forts Henry and Donaldson fall to General Grant, who was a Northern general, and he forces the Confederate retreat to the village of Shiloh. At Shiloh in April of that year, the bloodiest battle of the war takes place. There are a little over 24,000 casualties. 57% of those casualties are Northern, and 43% are Southern. So it looks like who won this battle? It looks like the North, or the South, right? Because they lost fewer men. But actually, this is a Northern or a blue victory, because they're able to take those forts and take Shiloh and force the Confederate retreat. So even though the North lost more men, it is still a Southern victory. And like I said, it is the bloodiest battle of the war to this point. That will change as the war progresses. Then in March of 1862, we have a battle between the Merrimac and the Monitor. So this is a naval battle. There are new kinds of ships in this time period, which are our first iron ships. They get the nickname ironclads. So one of them, the Merrimac, was taken by the Confederacy. It's actually renamed the CSA Virginia. So you might also hear this, the Virginia versus the Monitor. But these two ships meet off the coast of Virginia and start firing at each other. Now, what this kind of shows is neither side, after about 4 or 5 hours of battle, has really been able to do anything. And that's because these ships, the iron plating on the ships, are able to withstand the bullets and the cannons that are being fired. So it actually is a draw. The ships will go on to be in later battles before they are both sunk. But this just kind of shows the new technology that's going to be around during the Civil War. Next, in 1862 in general, the USA passes the first draft law in American history. Eventually, Anyone between the ages of 17 and 50 will be drafted. The North and the South will pass draft laws. The North also starts passing laws that allow African Americans to serve in the Union Army. When the war began, they did not allow that to happen. However, they realized that, you know what? We need more men to fight this war, and African Americans are more than willing to help. So they are segregated units, but there are units of all African American men, freed slaves, and men who were born free. On April 24th of 1862, Northern Admiral Farragut captures the city of New Orleans. This is going to be the beginning of the Anaconda Plan, splitting that Mississippi River. So he starts marching up the Mississippi River, going up the Mississippi River to prepare that stranglehold of the Confederacy by cutting the Confederacy into two. In June of July that year, we have a 7-day battle in which General Lee defends the city of Richmond against General McClellan. General McClellan was the general of the Army of the Potomac, so basically the Northern Army. But Lee is able to successfully defend themselves against Richmond, and this is going to be a pretty major blow for the Union. So 7 days battle, it is a gray victory, right? So moving right along, August 29th to 30th of 1862, we fight the Second Battle of Bull Run. So Lee strikes at the Potomac River in order to try and enter Maryland. McClellan, however, discovered that Lee's orders wrapped around a cigar. So basically the orders that he had been sending out, and they tried to hide them by wrapping them around the cigar, and he learned that Lee's army is temporarily separated from Jackson's army, which makes them much weaker, okay? So if you are General McClellan, at this point, you should start pursuing Lee's army because you know he's weaker. However, that's not exactly what happens. He does meet up with Lee's army at the Battle of Antietam, and this is the deadliest single-day battle in U.S. history. McClellan provokes the battle just outside of Sharpsburg, Virginia. The total number of dead exceeds, so is more than 26,000 in one day. However, as Lee is retreating, McClellan does not follow him. He could have finished Lee's army off and the war would have ended in September of 1862, but he doesn't. Lee flees and is able to regroup and rebuild his army. For this huge mistake, McClellan gets fired by Lincoln, and this is going to begin a major rivalry between these two men. So Lincoln fires McClellan for not pursuing Lee. McClellan becomes a major rival to Lincoln at this point. January 1st of 1863, Lincoln takes advantage of the Sharpsburg-Antietam win to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed slaves in rebelling states, okay? So think about that for a second. In the states that are rebelling against the Union, so basically the Confederate states, not the border states, which also have slaves, like Kentucky and Maryland have slaves, but those slaves do not get freed, okay? So this essentially, what it does is actually frees no one, because the South doesn't recognize Lincoln's authority. They're not going to free their slaves. The border states get to keep theirs. However, what this document does is makes slavery an explicit cause of the war. That's something that had never been stated before. But by issuing this document, slavery becomes one of the causes of the war. And Britain, who had been considering joining in with an alliance with the South, now says, you know what, we got to step back from this because slavery had been illegal in Great Britain. And now that slavery is part of what this war is being fought over, they're not willing to join in anymore. Okay, so it guarantees that Britain will not enter on the side of the Confederacy. July 13th to 16th of 1863, draft riots break out in New York City. Basically, there are Irish immigrants and other lower classes who are opposed to this policy of conscription, which is the draft. They riot against it, basically saying that it's unfair to poor men because rich men could actually pay a poor man to fight in their stead. So they're saying that this is not fair. Riots break out all over the city of New York, and over 100 people die. So this is showing that the war is starting to lose a lot of popularity up in the North especially. Also in 1863, the Union passes the nation's first income tax. So this is a tax on the money that you make, right? So 30% of my paycheck every month goes to the income tax. This is something that had not happened in this country before. So this is the first time that happens in order to raise money for the war. And finally, in May of that year, at Chancellorsville, Virginia, Lee meets General Hooker, who is forced into a Union retreat. So it's a victory for the South, right? The gray victory here. But Jackson, who returns to his camp at night, is shot by one of his own men who mistakes him at night for a Union officer. He is shot in the arm. They amputate his arm, his left arm, in order to try and save him. It is said that after Lee hears that Jackson had his arm amputated and is not looking so good, that he writes back, "Jackson may have lost his left arm, but I have lost my right," saying the man who, is the best general I've got, right? He dies of infection on May 10th, 1863. This is a huge blow to the Confederacy because Jackson and Lee were the best generals in the country at that time. So by losing Jackson, the South takes a major blow. Then, on July 1st, 1863, the major battle of the war is fought in Gettysburg, Virginia. So Lee, for the first time, goes on the offensive. He drives north into Virginia, trying to get into Pennsylvania. The two armies were not actually supposed to meet here. However, a group of Confederate soldiers go into the town of Gettysburg trying to find some shoes. Basically, they are out of supplies. They want shoes. And they run into a skirmish with the Union Army, and this is going to lead to the most major battle of the war. So if you look at this map here, the United States Army, the Union Army, holds Cemetery Ridge, okay, which is this hill right here. The South holds Seminary Ridge. So you see these two ridges facing each other. And they're basically battling over who's going to get to control two major strategic hills, Little Round Top and Cemetery Hill. So Cemetery Hill is over here, okay? Little Round Top is down here, all right? And it basically, whoever is going to control those hills are going to determine the outcome of the battle. So Union leader Chamberlain saves the Union lines from rebel artillery by charging into the Confederate lines, and they keep going at them, right? A lieutenant general named Pickett tries to charge into the Union lines. He actually gets the blame for this, but it was Lee's idea, but he was the one that was in charge of it. It's an unsuccessful charge. They're unable to take the high ground, and in the end, Lee's army is defeated. 28,000 men die on the Confederate side alone, and Lee is forced to retreat. This battle is known as the high tide of the Confederacy because if you think about high tide, that's the point where the tide reaches its highest point, right? So the Confederacy had been doing really good up until this point, but now we have a Union victory, and it starts to wane. The Confederate victory starts to wane quite a bit. These are just some pictures. This is a image of what the village of Gettysburg looked like, where the battlefield is over here. This is the town of Gettysburg. This was, as I said, one of the bloodiest battles of the war, and a lot of photographers were able to capture that brutality. So you can really just see that this was a hard-fought battle and a hard loss for the Confederacy. Then, June and July of that year, in Vicksburg, the Union starts sieging the city of Vicksburg and eventually captures Port Hudson in Louisiana. Grant, by doing this, accomplishes that Anaconda goal of splitting the Confederacy, okay? So General Grant becomes kind of the major leader for the Union at this point. So again, Vicksburg, Union win. In November of 1863, Union gives the Gettysburg Address to dedicate the battlefield cemetery there. This is a really important speech because up until this point, Americans, when you talk about the United States, would have said the United States are as a plural, like the United States are this, right? After this speech, Americans start to refer to the United States is. It is a singular. We are one country now. And we're going to talk about more the significance of this in class. But this is the really famous address that begins 7 years ago. And Lincoln was not actually supposed to give the main address. His address, the Gettysburg Address, only lasted a couple minutes long. There was a guy who came after him who spoke for 2 hours, a guy named Edward Everett. And Edward Everett said later that I should be glad that if I could flatter myself into say that I said as much in 2 hours as Lincoln said in 2 minutes. And in fact, the speech was over so quickly that photographers were not able to capture a photograph of Lincoln giving the speech. This is the only photograph of Lincoln leaving the stage at the end of his speech of the Gettysburg Address. We don't have a photograph of Lincoln actually giving the speech. All right, so moving on to spring of 1864, Lincoln appoints Grant as the new head of the Union Army, and he appoints General William Tecumseh Sherman to lead the war into the Deep South. So this is Grant, this is Sherman up here. So basically the Union is now taking advantage of their newfound victories, okay? So again, we're looking at Union victories here. First, we have the Wilderness Campaign, which is going to be Lee versus Grant. It is a series of battles. I call them running battles because basically what happens is they're kind of chasing each other throughout the wilderness, hence the name. It's around the area of Richmond. You can see there are several different battles there. This is also known as Grant's Overland Campaign. Basically, his goal is to try and run Lee down. He throws as many men as he can at Lee to try and make sure that Lee is just basically totally defeated. And the Wilderness Campaign is a victory for the Union, for Grant, okay? So Lee is being taken care of at the north. Sherman comes in to the south. So Sherman occupies the city of Atlanta in September and starts to burn the city. And what he does is pursue a policy of total war. This is a war on civilians, on towns and villages, as well as on soldiers, right? The idea, according to one of his men, is to make Georgia burn or make Georgia howl. One of his men, when they finally marched up their goal is to march from Atlanta up to Savannah and into the Carolinas. On reaching South Carolina, one of his men says, "This is where the treason began, and by God, here is where it shall end." When they reach North Carolina, the mayor of Raleigh actually surrenders to General Sherman in order to prevent him from destroying private property. So they stop that total war campaign when they get into North Carolina. The troops that they end up fighting in North Carolina are General Johnston's troops. However, Johnston does surrender to Sherman at Durham Station, now Durham, North Carolina, at Bennett Place. So this is just a picture of Sherman marching through Atlanta as Atlanta burns. This photograph down here is of Bennett Place, which is a small farmhouse in Durham. It's still there. You can still go visit it. I recommend that you do that. So Sherman got a really, really bad reputation for what he was doing in the South. They called him like a devil, and they hated him because he was just destroying everything in his path as he was marching through the South. So this is going to effectively end the war. So if you look here, this is where Sherman begins. He marches from Chattanooga to Atlanta, burns the city of Atlanta, marches to the sea, all right, that's the march to the sea, is Savannah, then marches up from Savannah into Columbia, the capital of South Carolina, up into North Carolina, where Johnston surrenders to him in Durham, okay. From the fall to spring of 1864 to 1865, Lincoln is up for re-election in 1864. Things had been looking pretty iffy for Lincoln, but with a lot of these victories, especially in the Wilderness Campaign and with Sherman's march to the sea, it ensures that Lincoln is going to win re-election against that of McClellan. McClellan actually, he was so mad about getting fired. He starts to campaign against Lincoln on a policy of like basically giving in to the South, letting them stay their own country, screw preserving the Union. We just want to end the war, okay? And so it looked like for a while McClellan might actually win because people were really tired of the war. However, Lincoln does win re-election because of all these major victories, which is going to lead to the surrender in April between the Wilderness Campaign and Lincoln's re-election. Lee finally is forced to surrender to General Grant. Sorry about that. In Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. The Confederate soldiers, it's a very generous surrender. They are given all of their possessions. They can keep everything they have with them, their horses, their weapons, and rations enough for 3 days, and they are allowed to return back home without any fuss, okay? This is a picture of the house where the surrender takes place. And what's really interesting about this is the guy who was living there used to live in Manassas, Virginia. All right. After the first Battle of Bull Run, a cannonball went through his kitchen. And so he and his family up and left Manassas and moved to Appomattox. And that is the same house where the surrender was signed. And this guy apparently said, because of this, the war began in my backyard and ended in my front parlor. So it's kind of a full circle sort of thing. So this is the end of the war. We're going to start trying to rebuild and reconstruct. However, but before that can happen, on April 15th, so less than a week later, Lincoln is assassinated by John Wilkes Booth in Ford Theater at Washington, D.C. He dies the next day, and this really kind of is a major blow. You know, the Union has just won the war. They're super excited, and Lincoln is killed. So it's a pretty major blow to the Union. So we'll get more in depth into class and some of these events and what kind of the significance of them are. But I hope this was a good overview for you. So I will see you soon. Goodbye.